Church, my hope is that we begin to inventory our habits, where we're spending our life, our energies, our time, our resources. It will point to what's most important. It will point to the idols in our life or to the God that we worship most. May we be a church that's different. How many of you remember America Online? America Online, AOL, yeah. Several years ago, they did something that was a little foolish. They were trying to demonstrate their reach to all of their users and consumers, and so they shared the online search history of about 700,000 of their users. Now, you're thinking, this is a really bad decision for a company to do something like that. But America Online, they took precautions. So instead of Bob down the street searching for NFL Sunday scores, they assigned a username. So it was user 451234, for example. And they assigned an anonymous username to all 700,000 of these users whose search history they revealed. They thought that they were demonstrating how powerful their company was from a marketing consumer research standpoint. The problem is they didn't use enough precautions, because quickly the New York Times demonstrated how, despite not revealing the names of the users, having access to their entire search history, they could quickly identify who these people actually were. Y'all remember the game Guess Who, the board game, the kids' board game Guess Who? If you get enough guesses, eventually you can, by a process of elimination, figure out who the other person is. The same was true with America Online. With enough insight into someone's search history, you can begin to narrow down exactly who the user is. So user 451234 was searching for the score of the Dallas Cowboys game that previous Sunday, and if it was a home game, you know the outcome, they lost. That's a separate point. But then that same user also searched for perhaps 2002 Ford Explorer transmission problems, right? And then they also searched for dog food, right? And then they also searched for weather in Omaha, Nebraska. And you can see how over a series of searches, you can get really specific to who these people are. Now, the stuff that people searched for weren't just sports scores and transmission issues with their vehicles. There were searches for silly things, funny things. There were searches for sad things. And as you can imagine, there were searches for truly disturbing things as well. You see, the entire search history of an individual, it paints quite a picture of who that person is. My question for us this morning is, what would our search history reveal about who we are? If we had to get up one at a time and share the results of our search history, what would people determine? What would they infer about who we are? You see, over the last several weeks, we've been in this series called The New American Idols, because we've been trying to talk about what it is that's behind the idols in our hearts. We're all on a search for something, right? We're all in pursuit of a type of life, a type of future. And the search that we're on says a lot about what we love. It says a lot about what we value and prioritize. Not just our search history, but the search with our time, the search with our relationships, the search with our resources and our calendar and our energies and our money. These searches, they reveal what we desire, what we long for, what our hopes and dreams are. And all of that, unless it's directed at God, will be directed towards an idol. This is the definition of idolatry that we've been wrestling with for the last several weeks. And idolatry is anything we love, anything we trust, or anything we obey more than God. Anything we love, anything we trust, anything we obey more than God. Now, the story that we're going to look at this morning to kind of wrap up this series is one that is at the conclusion of kind of a journey that we've been on with the people of Israel, right? A couple weeks ago, we talked about the giving of the 10 commandments to Moses on Mount Sinai, and at the top of the list of the commandments is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Then the second commandment, and you shall not make any gods in heaven or on earth or in the sea below. Today, the story we're going to look at, though, is the kind of further down the road, many generations later, as Joshua, now the leader of the people of Israel, is kind of giving his last speech, his last message and sermon to these people. Joshua's been along the ride this entire time. He's seen the way that these people struggle with the temptation of idolatry. Just like us, they lived in a world that was filled with idols. Now, their idols might have looked different. They might have had names for the idols of success or money or sex or love or prosperity or achievement. But it was still the same idols, still the same temptation, just maybe in a different name. And Joshua's watched how these people have struggled and wrestled and stopped and stumbled and started up again. And they're trying to navigate all of this. And the words that he gives to these people, I think, are probably the words that we need to hear as we end this series. It's a reminder that if we're not paying attention, if we're not careful, we're going to get pulled back into idolatry every single time. So this is what Joshua says to the people of Israel. He's gathered them all together. He gives them one last message from God, and these are the words that he shares. He says, now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose yourself this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. Now, what I want to point out in this is because our temptation to read this is to go, oh, I'm good, right? I don't worship gods from across the river. I don't worship the gods of my ancestors from Egypt. I don't worship the gods of the Amorites. I'm good. But implied in this is not another option of, or just don't worship anything at all. You see, we think that, one of the options for me would be I just don't worship any idols. And I'll worship God or maybe not worship God, but I don't have to worship idols. I don't have to fall prey to idolatry. You see, that's not the option that Joshua gives. What he says, in essence, is you're going to worship something. You're going to spend your life searching for something. The question is, who or what are you going to worship? In preparing for this message, I came across a graduation commencement speech by the writer and author David Foster Wallace. Now, clearly not a man of Christian faith, and he's not a theologian. But in this commencement address to Kenyon College, he identifies the same dynamic that grips the hearts of every human on this planet. This is what David Foster Wallace says. Again, not a Christian. He has no inclination or persuasion to try to move people towards a relationship with God. And yet he still comes to the same conclusion that Joshua does. The question isn't, will you worship something? The question is, what will you worship? This is what he says. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And the compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. We talked about this in previous weeks, that at the beginning, these idols, they promise you everything and ask of you nothing. And then in the end, they require everything from you and give you nothing in return. This is what David Foster Wallace is naming. They will eat you alive. He goes on. He says, if you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough, never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. or not pretty enough. And when time and age starts showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally grieve you. He keeps going, buckle up. Worship power, you will end up feeling weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to numb you to your own fear. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, and you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. But the insidious thing about these forms of worship is not that they're evil or sinful. Now, we've said this before. The things that we're inclined to hold up as idols are often good things. We just look to them or trust in them or love them in an incorrect manner, above God. These are often really good things in our lives. We just pursue them in an incorrect way. This is what he identifies. He says, these things aren't evil or sinful. It's that they're unconscious. We're not aware of it. These are our default settings. And then he ends this way. He says, they're the kind of worship you just gradually slip into, day after day, getting more and more selective about what you see and how you measure value without ever being fully aware that that's what you're doing. It's our default setting. It's what we gradually slip into without conscious awareness of it. This is exactly what Joshua names when he's talking to the people of Israel. He says, listen, you've got two choices about what you're going to worship if you're going to worship an idol. He gives a third choice in a second, but we'll get to that. The first two choices he presents to the people are, you're either going to worship the gods of your ancestors. These are the gods you've inherited. These are often kind of the unconscious gods that we adopt. You grew up in a house where one parent worshiped the altar of careerism, of success, praying to the idol in their office 60, 70, 80 hours a week. This is the culture and the climate you were in that moment. You absorb the water that you're in, right? You take on the environment that you find yourself in. And so if you grew up in that kind of household, Joshua's saying that it's going to be a natural inclination for you to gravitate towards worshiping those same type of idols. If for you weren't allowed to leave the house unless you looked your very best because of the strong preference of a parent, you always had to look presentable, you always had to have your hair combed a certain way, appearance was really important, your home always had to be put together, people couldn't come over until everything was just right, you had to keep up with your neighbors and your friends from kind of a lifestyle standpoint, you're always measuring and comparing. If that's the house and the world you grew up in, it's probably not a far stretch to say that you're inclined to lean towards those idols as well. Joshua's saying one of the things that we're inclined to worship are the gods of our ancestors, the idols of our ancestors, these things that just get passed down from generation to generation, right? When your parents say to you, that's what it means to be insert your last name. This is how people in our family act and live, right? They're imparting values and belief systems into you, oftentimes without even recognizing it. Now, parents, let me let you off the hook this morning. Wanting to have standards, values, priorities for your children to follow, not a bad thing. Those exist in our house as well. It's when those become the ultimate thing, right? When your success in school and the college that you get into is more important than your character or the Christian virtues that you live out as a person, now we've started to tip into idolatry. Now we've started to tip into dangerous territory. When how much money you make and your potential for success in life is more important to you than generosity and kindness and modeling the selflessness of Jesus Christ, now we're running risk of idolatry. These things that we unintentionally impart to the next generation, that were unintentionally imparted to us. I don't think much of this is malicious or evil, but like David Foster Wallace identified, it's insidious because it just happens naturally. The other option that Joshua points out, that David Foster Wallace points out as well, is the waters that we swim in our current day and age. These are the gods of the Amorites in the land that you're living in now in the language of Joshua. These are the idols that we see worshiped all around us, all that we see people pursuing and searching and chasing after. And the response to pushback is, well, this is just the way it is. This is just how you have to get ahead in life. This is just what you have to do to succeed. This is just what it means to be a person in this day and age. You feel like there's no opportunity to push back, to resist. You fear standing out in this way because you'll be socially ostracized. Look at them, they're trying to live into their Christian values. Allie talked about this last week. It's difficult to navigate values when they're competing against one another. We just look at the cultural zeitgeist and say, it's just how it has to be. And we give up. We just have to allow our kids to go to those parties after those football games and participate in whatever they want to do because that's just how it is. Shame on us. Shame on us. That is not how it has to be. We are called to be different. We are called to live differently. And when we acquiesce to the values of our culture and the values of our society, we have lifted those things up over our worship of God. And Joshua warns us of this. He says it's never going to be this intentional choice that you make to fall into the temptations of idolatry. It's going to be this natural, unperceptible slide into them. And this is what we have to watch out for. As we kind of take this concept out into our lives, as we move on in our sermon series and conversations as a church, we have to be vigilant. We have to be mindful of all of the idols that we unintentionally, unconsciously worship, whether passed down from generation to generation or because we just acquiesce to the culture around us because that's just how it is. Joshua says there is something else for you. Now, what he does is he presents a choice to these people. And this is the language that he uses. He says, choose this day who you will serve. And then he answers, but as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Now this word serve, he uses it 7 times in these 2 verses that we've just read. What it means is the direction and energies of your life, the habits that exist, where you spend your time, how you spend your resources, where you spend your energies, the friendships that you have or don't have, what your calendar looks like, what your hobbies look like. This is what it means to serve something, to give all of your resources towards it. Your emotional, mental resources, your physical resources, your financial resources. This is why our search history is probably a pretty good indication of the idols of our heart. The lifestyle that we aspire to have, the body or image that we aspire to have, the career that we aspire to have, all of the ways that our transaction statements and our calendars reveal the idols of our heart. This is what Joshua is calling the people towards. There has to be an intentional choice about where you are spending your life, those things that you are searching after. This is why he uses the word choose. Because if we're not intentional, if we don't make a choice, we've already seen what happens. We default to the idols all around us and the idols that we've inherited. But Joshua says, if you want to live differently, if you want to live as a follower of God, then you have to make a choice. And this word choose is not just a one-time choice. It's an every single day choice. Last night I officiated a wedding, and in the conversations around the commitment that the couple was making to each other, it's the exact same language. They weren't standing there in that moment making a choice to be married for that day, for that moment. The commitment and the covenant that they agreed to enter into was every single day I wake up and I choose you again. This is the same language that Joshua is using to the people. Choose this day, and then the day after, and then the day after that, and then the one that follows that. For eternity, choose where you're going to spend your life. Choose what you're going to search and chase after. Choose what's going to determine your values, your behaviors, your actions, how you'll determine how you spend your time and your energy and your resources. You have to choose. Because if you don't choose, a choice will be made for you. And you'll default to what you see around you and what you grew up with. So what does it look like to actually choose to serve the Lord? What does it actually look like for us to choose this day? I think it looks like repeated behaviors, repeated commitments. Another word for that would be habits. The limits, the boundaries that we predetermine and predecide that exist in our lives. This is why low-hanging fruit, this is why we talk about generosity the way that we do here as a church. I'm not bringing this up just because we're entering into our 2025 annual campaign, although we are. That's not why I bring it up. That's not because we have the cards and the seat backs in front of you. That's not why I mention this, but because it's just an obvious way for us to tangibly understand what this predetermination looks like. We ask you to make a plan because it's something that's pre-decided, so that next year, when you bump up against the how are we going to allocate our resources, you've already made a choice that now you just have to follow. You already made a choice of how you want to live based on the values that you want to demonstrate, the virtues that you want to live out in your life and in your family. Parents, this is so important, the season that you're in right now, especially if you have kids in the home. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. You are creating the climate and the environment for your children, for them to understand what it looks like to place God above everything else. God above school, God above friends, God above their relationships, God above their sports and extracurricular activities, God above everything else. Because if God's in the middle of the list, then he might as well not be on the list. We've talked about that previously. God says, I want to be one of one, not one of many. It doesn't mean that you can't try hard in school. It doesn't mean that you can't pursue great career opportunities. It doesn't mean that who you choose to spend your life with doesn't matter. All of those things matter. All of those things are important and good. And as parents, we should be talking to our children about them. Secondary to how we lead them in the faith. This is why we're a community here at this church. It's not just to bring your kids, drop them off, and we'll give them back to you in an hour and 10 minutes, depending on who's preaching, right? It's not what we're doing. We want to create a space where we do this together. It is hard enough to do, but it's even harder to do by yourself. This is why Joshua had this conversation with the entire group of people. He wants them to be a collective decision-making force. That way, when you're bumping up against the virtues that you want to instill in your parenting, which so many of you wrote on your prayer cards last week about the challenges of navigating the teenage years and how to parent well and how to parent according to a Christian belief system. It's really hard. It's really hard even when you're a pastor, right? You have to make that choice, but it's easier to make that choice when you can look to your left and to your right to see other people who are making the same choices as you. Church, my hope is that we begin to inventory our habits, where we're spending our life, our energies, our time, our resources. It will point to what's most important. It will point to the idols in our life or to the God that we worship most. May we be a church that's different. May we do this together. May we make a difference in this world. Let's pray. Gracious God, what a gift to be here together this morning. To be learning what it means to pursue you, to search for you, to spend our lives chasing after you. God, you are the only thing in our life that can save us. None of these other things that we worship or chase after or pursue can bring us the hope and the meaning and the fulfillment that we long for, the salvation that we long for. God, it is only found in you. And so, God, equip us. Help us to connect to each other, to do this together as we begin to build habits that reinforce our daily choice to serve you. We pray this in your name. Amen.